Hi, and welcome to TTELT, Teaching Tips for English Language Teachers, a program of educators worldwide. I'm your host today, Melanie Gobert.
Hello, everyone. This is Melanie Gobert, your host for today's episode of TTELT, Teaching Tips for English Language Teachers. Joining us today is Olga Litvinova. Olga is a freelance teacher from Russia. She's a translator, and she's written a book, and she's joining us from Armenia. Good morning, Olga.
Morning, how are you?
I'm good. So tell us about the book you've written.
Yeah, so I'm really excited to be sharing this story about my book. So I can see that it has been a long time in the making, but it started from my Fulbright program. So back in 2017, I got a scholarship to conduct my research. So I was a university teacher back then. So I spent a year in the US, in northern New Jersey at Montclair State, doing my research on bilingualism. So basically, at that time, I was writing my PhD. So I had my proposal. I had this main part of my research, which was analyzing second language writing. So it was mainly quantity research, which I wasn't excited about at that time because I found that quantity research is not up my alley so much. So then, and as a side project, I was also conducting those interviews with bilinguals. You know, I had this passion for journalism. Growing up in the post-Soviet Russia, I just loved foreign languages, and then I wanted to be a journalist in English. So that was my dream, and that was my way to reach out to international audiences, meet people from different cultures and places, because back then when I was a kid and teenager, Russians didn't travel that much. So it was my first time traveling for so long and being away from home for so long, because before that I had only traveled to conferences just for a couple of days maximum, and that was it. But here I was spending 10 months on the other side of the world. So I was interviewing people about their bilingual experiences, about their language biographies, as we call them. So at that time, I was not really aware of which specific methods I was using. Of course, it was narrative research, but it was mostly journalistic because I wanted to sit down with people, record those interviews. Of course, it was a little bit challenging first because I needed all these consent forms. You know, in America, it was just something that we were not used to in Russia. Because in Russia, I would just have sat down with a person and started talking, but I had to go through ARB and all these things. So for me, it was more like a journalistic project, something I was doing again as a side thing. So we were talking about bilingual experiences of people. So that was my way to kind of record my memories of being in the United States as a language teacher as well, and talking to people. And what I found is that people had similar struggles. So no matter where they were in the world, so they had similar issues learning languages, because sometimes we think that it's all about where we come from, you know, this David Crystal classification. So you have to be inner circle, outer circle, country, and so on. But I found that the universals were pretty the struggles were pretty universal there. And then, of course, I wanted people to share their strategies for language learning, just some kind of success stories, because when I had my students, and even before that, I was teaching at university, I also had some private students, and everybody wants some kind of recipe for success when it comes to language learning. But what I found is that most people were kind of confused when I asked them, so what do you think would be a recipe for success? Is there a specific strategy that you can employ to help you become successful language learners? Because all of my participants were successful. They could hold a conversation in English. They were living in the United States for some time, but mostly they were fellow Fulbrighters as well, just sharing their experiences, of course, and also some other people who are interested in linguistics, because that's another thing that I think we're all familiar with, that recruiting participants can be a struggle, because even if your friends might not be so willing to sit down and talk to you sometimes, so it can be quite difficult. So most people who ended up participating were people also interested in language learning, language teaching, so they could share those interests. So I spent almost a year conducting this research, and then I went back to Russia. So I actually had to, and I made the decision to quit my university job. So it was kind of challenging decision. So I decided to pursue a freelancing path. And for some time, this research just was put on hold because I decided to stop my PhD research and focusing on building up my kind of personal brand as a teacher. And then pandemic hit, and then these conflicts started. So first there were a lot of things that we had to worry about. So this research was just here. And then I came here to Armenia. Actually, today it's my second anniversary of coming here for the first time. So I talked to other people, other Fulbrighters, kind of reunited with the Fulbright community after some time of being mostly isolated, not traveling, just kind of blocked. And then with this February 22, things got even worse in this regard. And then I thought, why should I just wait for this research just to do something with it? I decided to actually write a book because it's been my dream to write a book. That's probably it's coming from Russia, this country with very rich literary heritage. We have Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Pushkin, all these great writers. So we all probably want to write books, and we love words as Russians, as a nation, but somehow we feel humbled to do that because we feel that we are not good enough. So why would I write a book if I'm not as good as Pushkin, for example? I think lots of Russians would relate to this kind of thinking. And I thought, well, if I don't do my PhD now, so probably I can write a book. I can share this experience with different audiences, with my colleagues, with with people from other disciplines. Because when I met Fulbrighters, I found that we have something in common. So even people coming from other spheres in humanities, we shared something. So I thought they could be my audience, but it was a struggle thinking about what my audience would be. But I decided that it will be kind of popular science book. So that's what I wanted to do. So I decided to actually give myself only 4 months for writing, which sounds crazy now looking back, but actually I managed to do that. So I thought, well, I was here in Armenia before Christmas in 2022, and I thought when I would go back in spring, the book would be ready. So I will be able to have some book presentations, book talks here, and so on. So one of the struggles was, of course, how to structure the book. That was pretty difficult because I had those interviews, and then I thought if I just publish the interviews, it will be boring, just people reading interviews, and that's all. So I ended up having 50 people, which is a lot. And I was thinking, should I include some people and exclude others? And then I thought, no, I need to include everything, and it will be kind of a diary of my time in the US. So I put them in the chronological order, and I decided to include some information on how I met these people. So adding so-called cinematographic effects. So just, for example, for my first interview, we sat down in Central Park in New York. We had a conversation. So I share some story about how I met these people, because I didn't want to say participant 1 said this, participant 2 said that. I wanted to give these people names. I wanted to make them part of my story. So being a teacher, being bilingual, meeting people. So I also shared some of the struggles of just being in America, just, collecting my data, interacting with the research community. So it was a kind of a diary in the first part. So my own impressions of meeting these people, their interviews, but I didn't include the exact transcripts. I just said that it was a kind of a summary. So I just used reporting verbs and things like that. So it was not just question answer. I thought it would be just very repetitive. So I just decided to kind of show that it's my own interpretation of this story. So it was a kind of journalistic lens. And then in the second part of the book, of course, I wanted to do justice to my own background as a researcher. So I included the analysis, so some context analysis of the information I got. So I decided, of course, to include some citations, references, because during all these years, I have been reading extensively on bilingualism, especially on the topic of identity, because after coming back from the US, I found that it's the issue which is very pertinent. So mostly, I would say it's social science, like political science, social science. They focus on identity a lot, but in linguistics, we somehow don't. So I thought it could be an interesting way to have this interdisciplinary view of identity and include that, because it came up a lot in the interviews. For example, when I asked people, do you feel like a different person when you're switching from one language to another? And lots of people were surprised just hearing this question, but they found that it's actually something that can motivate or demotivate you, because you have to decide whether you want to project this new image, new identity, or you just become you still you, but you just speak another language. So that was a very difficult question, which I dedicated some chapters as well to. So it was a kind of a struggle as well, how to structure everything without going too deep, because it was still not PhD research. I wanted to make it interesting, but still showing that I'm not this kind of person who just wants to simplify everything. And just so first I understood that some lay people might be reading the book, but I wanted to show that I also have expertise in the topic. And in the third part, then I also,
because we're almost out of time, but I do have one final question. How has the process been for promoting your book, selling your book so far?
Yeah, so it's not been easy, to be honest, because I found that as a language teacher, I might not be so well versed in self-branding, marketing. So probably as teachers, we have to be more humble. So it was difficult. I had a few book presentation, book talks, but of course we cannot expect a huge turnout of people. So of course, mostly I've been just giving this book to my friends, but also I've been able to sell some copies. It's actually on Amazon and some Russian platforms, but it's not been easy. So I think that it's, as I keep saying, that it's a whole different process, writing a book and actually trying to sell it and monetize it. So of course, before I had started writing, I didn't think that I would make a fortune selling it, because it's not something that a lot of people might be willing to pay for. But I'm thinking of how to do that, because I also have my podcast, my personal website, just trying to promote what I do. But it's not been easy at all. So, but I would say that I think a lot of fellow scientists and researchers would relate that. So we need a separate training, or we have to have some other people helping us to deal and navigate this marketing arena.
Okay, thank you a lot for joining us today, Olga.
Yeah, sure, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
This has been your host for today's episode of TTELT podcast. This has been your host, Melanie Gobert. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. Share with us how you are using these tips. Leave us a comment or voice message on social media or at ttelt.org. Thanks for joining this episode of TTELT, brought to you by Educators Worldwide. Follow, like, and subscribe to TTELT on your social media, and try a new teaching tip today.